Las Vegas, mid-1970s. The Hilton International, its ballroom glowing with chandeliers and the smell of champagne. On stage, Elvis Presley, draped in his iconic white cape, every eye fixed on him. The crowd is a mixture of factory workers on vacation and wealthy socialites flown in from New York and Los Angeles. The atmosphere crackles, part worship, part tension, as if something unscripted is about to happen. At one table near the front sits a woman known for her sharp tongue, a socialite who came not to listen, but to judge. She leans forward, her jewels glittering under the lights, and when Elvis pauses to speak, she lets her laughter cut across the hall. "My God! Listen to him drag those words," she says loudly, making sure those around her hear. "He sounds like some country bumpkin from the sticks." The remark hangs in the air like smoke. Conversations falter, glasses freeze mid-air. Thousands of people turn instinctively toward the stage. Elvis has heard ridicule before, but never in a room like this, never at the very height of his reign. He stops. The orchestra falls silent behind him. He wipes his brow, looks straight into the crowd, his eyes locking in the direction of the voice. The audience holds its breath, waiting. What he does next will silence the hall and turn an insult into one of the most unforgettable moments of his career. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The smell of dust lingered in the hot Mississippi air. In Tupelo, the streets weren't paved everywhere, just long stretches of reddish dirt that clung to shoes and left a fine powder on the porches of every house. For the Presleys, that dust seemed permanent, like a second skin they couldn't wash away. Their little wooden shack stood on Old Saltillo Road, its walls so thin that in winter the wind slipped straight through, and in summer the heat baked them alive inside. It was here, in 1935, that Elvis was born into a life already scarred by struggle. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, had almost nothing. Vernon was often restless, chasing odd jobs that barely kept food on the table. When Elvis was only 3, Vernon was arrested for altering a check, sentenced to a year in prison. For the boy, it meant his father's absence at the exact time he was beginning to understand what family meant. Gladys became everything: mother, protector, provider, the anchor of a fragile world. Neighbors in Tupelo were a mix of poor whites and black families, bound together by hardship more than by choice. Children ran barefoot through the same dusty yards, sang in the same small churches, and spoke in voices colored by the slow rhythms of the South. That drawl wasn't just an accent. It was the sound of survival, of people who had little but carried themselves with pride. It would become the cadence that marked Elvis for life, though he couldn't know it then. On Sundays, music was everywhere. The clap of hands in the black churches down the road mixed with the hymns sung in the Little Assembly of God chapel. Elvis, still small enough to be lifted onto a pew, soaked it all in. He listened not just with his ears, but with his whole being. The deep, sorrowful notes of gospel seemed to seep into his bones, shaping a language of emotion that he would never lose. At night, when his mother stroked his hair to help him sleep, she whispered, "Don't you ever be ashamed of where you come from." But Tupelo was not gentle with children who stood out. At school, Elvis's clothes were second-hand, sometimes patched, always worn. Other boys, whose families had a little more, mocked the holes in his shirts, or the fact that his lunch was often nothing more than a biscuit. His voice, too, became a target. The thick Southern drawl he had picked up from both sides of the tracks marked him as country. The city kids, or those who wanted to be seen as better than the rest, mimicked his speech, twisted his words into cruel jokes. Elvis rarely fought back. He had a way of taking the sting in silence, staring at the ground until the laughter passed. Inside, though, it carved into him. He carried those moments, stored them quietly, as if each taunt was a stone laid in the foundation of something he hadn't yet built. Music became the only escape. Someone in the neighborhood always had a guitar, battered and missing a string or two. Elvis would stand nearby, eyes wide, absorbing every chord. Eventually Gladys, with money scraped together from sewing and washing, bought him his first guitar for his 11th birthday. It wasn't much, just a cheap instrument. But for Elvis, it felt like freedom. When his fingers stumbled across the strings, awkward at first, the sound filled the small room with a promise bigger than the walls could contain. The smell of pine boards, the crackle of an old radio broadcasting blues from Beale Street, the sound of cicadas at dusk, all of it became part of him. His accent, shaped by every word spoken in Tupelo's kitchens and porches, was the same accent that carried into his songs. It was never just the way he spoke. It was the echo of every prayer his mother whispered, every hymn shouted in church, every joke cracked by barefoot kids in the dust. Years later, when the world laughed at that same accent, Elvis would remember these days. He would remember the hunger, the thin walls, and the feel of his mother's hand on his head. What others mocked as unpolished or hillbilly was, for him, the truest connection to who he was. In Tupelo, he learned that silence could sometimes shield you, but music could speak for you. Every insult about his voice became fuel. Every smirk about his country ways made him hold tighter to the belief his mother had planted. Never be ashamed of where you come from. And so, while the dust of Mississippi clung to his shoes, it also clung to his voice. It would travel with him out of Tupelo, into Memphis, onto the stage, into the lights. Even decades later, when a wealthy woman in Las Vegas mocked his words in front of thousands, the wound it opened was not fresh. It was the same scar first cut in the classrooms and playgrounds of Tupelo. Because for Elvis, that accent wasn't just sound, it was memory, survival, and love bound into every syllable. It was the South itself, raw, imperfect, unshakable, living in his throat. And no matter how many laughed, he could never abandon it. Memphis in the late 1940s was a city caught between two worlds. On one side were the polished storefronts downtown, where businessmen in suits strolled Beale Street under neon lights. On the other side, in neighborhoods where the Presleys lived, life was measured in rent deadlines and the sound of freight trains rattling through the night. For Elvis, newly moved from Tupelo, Memphis was overwhelming and alive, a place where music poured from every corner. He carried with him his cheap guitar, the one his mother had fought to buy years earlier. It was the only possession he truly cherished, a companion through the long afternoons when he felt like an outsider. At Hume's High School, classmates noticed his country clothes, his shyness, and, always, that southern drawl. It made him different in a city where young men tried to iron out their speech to sound more proper. Elvis didn't. He spoke the way he had always spoken, the way people in the neighborhood spoke. To him, it wasn't something to hide. It was simply who he was. Yet it was this very difference that would one day set him apart. After school, he would wander to Beale Street, where blues spilled from open doors and gospel harmonies drifted from churches. He stood on the edge of crowds, watching musicians bend notes on battered guitars, soaking in rhythms that seemed far older than the city itself. He didn't play with them. He wasn't bold enough yet, but he listened, memorizing, holding the sound deep inside. By the early 1950s, a restless urge pushed him toward something bigger. Sun Records, a small studio run by Sam Phillips, had a reputation for giving a chance to unknown talent. Elvis, working as a truck driver, saved enough to walk into that studio in 1953 and pay a few dollars to record a song as a gift for his mother. The session seemed ordinary at first, just another boy with a guitar, but there was something in his phrasing, in the way his voice lifted certain words with that unmistakable southern edge that made the engineer look up. When Sam Phillips finally listened, he didn't just hear a singer. He heard a sound that carried both sides of the South, the rawness of country and the soul of the blues. Phillips later admitted he had been searching for a white singer who could bring the feel of black music to a wider audience. Elvis, without even realizing it, embodied exactly that. His accent wasn't a liability. It was the very marker of authenticity. Still, the world outside Sun Records didn't see it so kindly. When Elvis first performed live in 1954 with Scotty Moore and Bill Black, crowds didn't know what to make of him. He moved on stage in ways polite singers never did. Hips swaying, legs jittering as if the rhythm had taken control. His introductions, thick with Tupelo and Memphis drawl, drew laughter from some. "Hillbilly," people muttered. Others whispered that he sounded uneducated, too raw for mainstream radio. Newspapers reinforced it. A review after one of his early shows described him as a hillbilly singer with a Negro sound. The label wasn't meant as praise. Editors thought they were mocking him. But the words only spread curiosity. Who was this young man who sang with a southern slur, who refused to tame his vowels to fit the expectations of polished pop? For Elvis, the sting of ridicule was familiar. He had felt it as a boy in Tupelo, when classmates laughed at his clothes. Now it echoed again, only louder, printed in black ink for thousands to read. But instead of retreating, he doubled down. He never tried to flatten his accent in interviews. He spoke the way he always had, a mix of Tupelo drawl and Memphis street rhythm. It became part of the package, inseparable from the music. In the studio, that accent colored his phrasing in ways no vocal coach could replicate. When he sang "That's All Right" in 1954, it wasn't just the upbeat rhythm or the slapped bass that caught attention. It was the way his voice stretched and curled, turning simple words into something urgent, emotional, undeniably Southern. The song didn't sound like it came from New York or Los Angeles. It sounded like it came straight out of the dirt roads of Mississippi and the neon-lit nights of Memphis. Fans responded before critics did. Teenagers, especially those from working-class families, heard something in his voice that mirrored their own worlds. They didn't laugh at the accent. They recognized it. For them, it was a relief to hear someone on stage who didn't pretend to be from somewhere else. But the backlash remained strong. Journalists labeled him vulgar, crude, even dangerous. The irony was sharp. The very accent that tied him to his roots, that made him believable to those who knew struggle, was being cast as a weakness by those who controlled the narrative. And yet, every insult seemed to fuel his fire. By the mid-1950s, Elvis had become a sensation. Girls screamed at his shows, radio stations played his singles non-stop, and his records sold by the millions. Still, he never forgot those early articles, the mocking tones of reporters imitating his speech. Fame didn't erase the sting, it only magnified the contrast. Here he was, adored by crowds, yet still branded by some as the hillbilly with hips, and he refused to change. That was the quiet defiance in him, the decision to let the South remain in every word he sang, every word he spoke. He could have hired speech coaches, polished his interviews, smoothed the drawl. But he didn't. To him, losing the accent meant losing the truth. It was the same truth his mother had whispered when she told him never to be ashamed. It was the truth Sam Phillips recognized when he heard that first recording. It was the truth that made teenagers across America feel like Elvis was one of them, not some distant star. From Memphis to the stage, his voice carried the weight of his roots. What others dismissed as crude became the very signature of his rise. And while critics mocked, the crowds only grew larger, hungrier, ready to hear more from the boy whose accent was never an accident, but a living testament to where he came from. By the mid-1970s, Elvis stood at the pinnacle of fame, yet also in the twilight of his strength. Las Vegas had become his fortress and his burden, its stages glittering, its lights eternal, its audiences wealthy and expectant. Night after night, he walked into showrooms where the scent of expensive cigars mingled with perfume strong enough to cling to velvet curtains. Dealers shuffled cards only a few steps away in the casino, but inside the concert hall, all eyes fell on him. He was no longer the hungry young man from Memphis trying to prove himself. He was the king. The jumpsuits were brighter, the belts heavier, the stage sets grander. But under the rhinestones, he was still the boy from Tupelo, carrying the weight of memory and accent. Every time he opened his mouth to speak between songs, that southern inflection rolled across the room. Most cheered. It was familiar, comforting. But in Las Vegas, where audiences came with diamonds around their necks and a sense of superiority in their posture, not everyone saw it that way. Elvis always knew when a crowd was with him. It was a sixth sense, like reading a weather front in the air. He could feel applause before it started, could sense hesitation before the first laugh. When the energy aligned, he glowed. When it didn't, the tension hung in the room like smoke. And in Vegas, some nights were battles disguised as concerts. On one of those nights, the ballroom of the Hilton was filled with businessmen and their wives, movie stars seated near the front, and tourists hoping to carry home a story about seeing Elvis live. The orchestra tuned softly. Lights swept over a sea of sequins and tuxedos. From backstage he heard the murmur of glasses clinking, the polite but restless chatter of people who believed they'd seen everything worth seeing. The show began with the familiar rush. Brass section sharp, drums pounding, Elvis stepping into the spotlight with a flourish that made the audience erupt. For an hour he carried them, classic after classic, movements still sharp, voice still carrying that gospel fire. The applause came easy, but he noticed pockets of resistance. A table of executives near the front barely moved, their laughter reserved for one another, not for him. And at the center of that table sat a woman, whose posture radiated disdain. She was elegantly dressed, her jewels catching the light like shards of glass. When Elvis paused between songs to speak, just a casual line, a joke delivered in his Tupelo drawl, she leaned toward her companions and mimicked his words. Not once, but twice, exaggerating the vowels for effect. Her friends chuckled, the sound sharp enough for him to hear even over the buzz of the hall. Elvis kept going, but he felt it. The same sting he had felt as a boy on the schoolyard when other children mocked his clothes and accent now echoed in the most glamorous room in America. Except this time, thousands of people were watching. He pressed forward, singing with more force, but his awareness sharpened. Every spotlight felt hotter, every note heavier. The laughter from that table returned again, low, cutting, just loud enough for others nearby to notice. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to hear. Elvis caught eyes with fans in the front rows who looked at him with sympathy, as if they too understood the insult. The moment came during a ballad. He sang with tenderness, sweat glistening on his forehead, when the woman's voice pierced through again. This time she didn't just mimic, she repeated a phrase he had spoken earlier in a mocking sing-song, her tone dripping with superiority. The sound sliced through the orchestra's soft strings, and Elvis, mid-song, went silent. The room froze. The orchestra faltered, instruments hanging on a suspended cord. Glasses stopped mid-air. For a heartbeat, nothing moved but the slow drip of sweat down his temple. He lowered the microphone just slightly, scanning the crowd. Everyone knew exactly what had happened. Thousands of eyes followed his gaze as he shifted it, almost imperceptibly, toward the table at the center. The air thickened. The audience, moments ago basking in music, now sat on edge. The faint buzz of air conditioning hummed against the silence. For a man who had faced soldiers, critics, screaming mobs, nothing compared to this. A single insult in a room of opulence, echoing against decades of wounds. Elvis had choices. He could laugh it off. He could fire back with a joke sharper than hers. He could even ignore it, keep singing, pretend the moment never happened. But instead, he paused, letting the silence build. His hand tightened on the microphone, then relaxed. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected. Long enough for even the drunkest gambler in the back to realize that something fragile, something rare, was unfolding. In that pause, the weight of his journey hung in the air. The boy from Tupelo mocked for speaking country. The young man dismissed by reporters as a hillbilly singer. The star now standing in front of the world's wealthiest, hearing the same laughter again. It was as if all those moments had converged into one. The woman shifted in her seat, suddenly aware that the spotlight, though invisible, had found her. Her companions fidgeted, their smirks fading into unease. Around them, silence pressed harder, thicker, like the whole room was holding its breath. Elvis's chest rose and fell, his eyes fixed, his jaw tight. Then, without a word, he raised the microphone again, but did not sing. Instead, he simply looked out across the audience, every movement deliberate, every second amplified by the hush. The next word he would speak, everyone knew, would matter more than any lyric. And that was where the tension crystallized. Not in the music, not in the performance, but in the raw human moment between insult and reply. Thousands leaned forward, waiting to see how a man who had been laughed at his whole life would answer mockery on the grandest stage of all. The ballroom was built for noise, for laughter, applause, the crash of an orchestra in full swing. But in that instant, it turned into a chamber of silence. The violins had fallen still, the brass section held their instruments frozen mid-air, and even the waiters stopped mid-step, with trays in hand. The only sound was the low hum of the lights above, and the faint clink of a glass being set down too quickly. Elvis stood at the center of it all, motionless except for the slow rise of his chest. His sequined suit shimmered under the white beams, but his eyes didn't sparkle. They locked straight ahead, steady and unblinking, fixed in the direction of the mocking voice. The woman who had laughed sat back, trying to wear her confidence like armor, though the weight of his gaze made her shift in her chair. For years, Elvis had answered critics with music, sometimes with humor, but rarely with direct confrontation. He had been trained by experience to absorb blows in silence. Yet now the pause was deliberate, sculpted, a silence louder than any melody he could have played. He lowered the microphone from his mouth and set it slightly aside, almost casually, so that it rested against his thigh. The gesture was small, but electric. Without amplification, without the booming echo of technology, he began to speak in a voice quiet enough that people in the back leaned forward instinctively. I grew up in a place where houses were made of wood so thin you could hear the wind sing through them at night, he began, his accent wrapping around every word. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And every Sunday morning, my mama would take me to church. We'd sing, loud as we could, because we believed music was the one thing nobody could take from us. The audience was transfixed. His words were simple, almost unpolished, but they cut through the air sharper than any lyric. He didn't need to raise his voice. The raw honesty did the work. She worked herself near to death, Elvis continued. Long hours, small pay. And one day, when she had just enough saved, she bought me a guitar. She told me, "Don't ever be ashamed of where you come from." His voice caught for a moment, not theatrical but real, a faint break that echoed the boy who had once been told he was less than others. Then, slowly, he lifted his head, his gaze circling the hall before returning, unshaken, to the table where the woman sat. "So, when you hear this accent," he said, each word landing with the weight of a stone, "that's not just me talking. That's my mama talking. That's my neighbors in Tupelo. That's the voices of the folks who showed me how to sing. If that sounds funny to you, then you're not laughing at me. You're laughing at them." The words dropped like iron. No music, no punchline, just truth. The atmosphere shifted in a heartbeat. The ripple of nervous laughter that had followed the woman's mockery vanished, swallowed by an almost sacred hush. Around her table, faces stiffened with embarrassment. Glasses were lowered without a sip taken. Some in the audience looked at the woman with thinly veiled disdain. Others simply turned away, unwilling to share in her cruelty. Elvis didn't gloat, didn't sneer, didn't stretch the moment. He stood with the dignity of a man who had learned long ago that silence and truth carried more force than anger ever could. His stillness was its own rebuke, more devastating than 1,000 sharp words. Even the woman's posture betrayed her unease. Where earlier she had leaned forward with confidence, now she sat rigid, arms crossing slightly, her expression caught between defiance and shame. The jewels at her neck sparkled under the lights, but they looked cold, powerless against the storm of attention that had turned upon her. The audience, however, leaned toward Elvis with a collective breath, their hearts beating in unison with his calm cadence. The connection was almost physical. It wasn't just his story. It was their story, too. People in the room who had grown up with little, who had been mocked for their roots, felt themselves reflected in his words. Even those who hadn't shared his background could feel the honesty pressing against them, undeniable. And then he stopped. No grand conclusion, no sermon, no explanation. Just silence again, but this time it was filled, not empty. It pressed down heavier than the chandeliers above, heavier than the stage itself. It was the silence of a truth that could not be challenged, a truth that demanded respect. In that moment, the room wasn't in Las Vegas anymore. It wasn't a casino ballroom with velvet chairs and overpriced champagne. It was a memory made flesh, a wooden shack in Tupelo, a mother's hand on her son's head, the echo of hymns sung so loudly they rattled the thin walls. Elvis had pulled them all into his past, and by doing so, reminded them of his humanity. The orchestra remained silent, instruments poised, waiting for a signal. But none came. Elvis held the room without music, without theatrics, with nothing more than his presence. And the audience, used to spectacle, realized they were witnessing something rarer than pyrotechnics or flashing costumes. They were witnessing a man standing in the truth of his roots, unshaken by wealth, by ridicule, or by the hollow laughter of one voice. And though the pause lasted only seconds, it stretched in memory like eternity. The silence had become the performance. The silence that had fallen over the ballroom was not empty anymore. It pulsed, like the still air before a storm. Elvis stood motionless for a breath longer, letting the weight of his words seep into every corner of the room. Then, slowly, almost without ceremony, he reached for the guitar resting on its stand beside him. The polished wood gleamed under the stage lights, ordinary to look at, yet in his hands it seemed to carry the force of memory itself. He didn't signal the orchestra. He didn't announce the next song. Instead, he brushed his fingers lightly over the strings, producing a soft, almost hesitant chord. It was fragile at first, like something private that wasn't meant for thousands of ears. The room, already hushed, sank into a deeper silence as people strained to hear. The first notes were unmistakable. "That's all right." The same song that had changed his life back in 1954, recorded in a cramped Memphis studio when no one outside his neighborhood even knew his name. But this wasn't the upbeat, rollicking version the world had memorized. He played it stripped bare, slower, each note stretching like a confession. His voice entered quietly, almost like a whisper, raw, unguarded, carrying the very accent that had just been mocked. There was no effort to smooth it, no attempt to polish the edges. If anything, he leaned into it, letting the drawl stretch across the vowels until every word felt soaked in Tupelo's dust and Memphis's heat. The audience leaned forward instinctively. They had heard this song 1,000 times, but not like this. It wasn't entertainment anymore. It was testimony. It was as if he was telling them, "This is who I was when the world first heard me, and this is who I still am." For a long moment, even the orchestra sat stunned, their instruments unused. Then, as if carried by his conviction, the conductor lifted his baton and the strings eased in softly. The gradual swell was delicate, not overpowering, framing his voice rather than covering it. The song began to breathe, expanding from a personal confession into a collective experience. Eyes in the audience began to glisten. The rhythm, though slower, had a pulse that seemed to line up with their own hearts. The woman at the table, once the source of cruel laughter, now sat rigid, her face pale under the glare of lights. No one looked at her anymore. She had ceased to exist in the story unfolding on stage. Every gaze was fixed on Elvis. And then, something extraordinary happened. As the song rose toward its chorus, Elvis's voice gathered strength. What began as a murmur swelled into full resonance, soaring above the hall with the force of a man reclaiming everything that had been stolen by ridicule. The orchestra caught up, brass and percussion joining in, until the room vibrated with sound. It wasn't just music anymore. It was redemption. People began applauding during the song, not waiting for it to end. First a few claps, tentative, then a wave spreading across the ballroom. Some stood to their feet, unable to remain seated under the weight of what they were witnessing. By the time the final chords rang out, the applause had become thunder, rattling the chandeliers and drowning out even the last notes of the orchestra. Elvis lowered the guitar gently, his breathing heavy, his chest rising and falling as though he had just poured out not a performance, but a lifetime. He looked out across the crowd, men in tuxedos now clapping with genuine fervor, women in gowns brushing away tears they hadn't expected. The transformation was complete. A hall that had once contained laughter at his expense was now unified in reverence. At the woman's table, her companions clapped too, some even standing, desperate not to appear aligned with her earlier cruelty. She remained seated, her smile forced, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The spotlight no longer belonged to her. It had turned into a mirror that exposed her pettiness for all to see. Elvis didn't gloat. He didn't glance at her again. Instead, he let the applause wash over him, not as victory, but as communion. He knew the crowd wasn't just celebrating a song. They were celebrating the truth he had shared, the dignity with which he had borne an insult. When the noise finally subsided, he leaned toward the microphone, voice calm, almost tender. "That's the first song I ever recorded," he said, his accent unsoftened, every syllable ringing with pride. "Didn't think I'd be singing it in Vegas 20 years later, but here we are." The crowd erupted again, laughter this time not at him, but with him. The tension was gone, dissolved into a wave of warmth. The moment was no longer about mockery, it was about triumph without vengeance. He had turned insult into art, humiliation into transcendence. The very accent used against him had become his weapon, his anchor, his glory. And as the orchestra prepared for the next number, Elvis stood taller than ever. He hadn't just reclaimed the room, he had redefined it. What had begun as a night of entertainment had transformed into something greater. A reminder that dignity doesn't shout, it sings. The atmosphere was no longer brittle with tension, but alive with reverence. People who had come expecting a show left realizing they had witnessed something far more rare. A man who turned pain into music and left everyone in the room changed because of it. When the echoes of applause finally began to settle, a different energy replaced them. It wasn't the usual roar of excitement that followed an Elvis show. This was quieter, more reverent, like the hush that falls inside a church after the last hymn. The air in the Las Vegas Hilton ballroom seemed to thrum with something invisible, as if every person inside was connected by a single thread. Elvis remained at the microphone, his face still glistening under the heat of the lights, but he didn't rush into the next song. He let the silence linger, not as a pause, but as part of the performance itself. For a moment, he looked almost reflective, his gaze drifting across the audience as if he were trying to see not their jeweled gowns or tuxedos, but their hearts. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, stripped of showmanship. "I've always just been a boy from the South," he said, his drawl stretching across the syllables without apology. "This voice, this way I speak, it's who I am. And it gave me everything I've ever been able to share with you." The words weren't polished, they weren't rehearsed, yet they fell into the crowd with a weight that no perfectly written line could carry. It was truth, plain and unguarded. For a beat, no one moved. Then applause burst forth again, but this time it was different. Not the kind of clapping that fills time between songs, not the automatic rhythm of casino audiences. It was raw, irregular, waves of people standing one after another until the entire hall was on its feet. The sound was thunderous, but the emotion behind it was deeper than excitement. They weren't applauding just a performer. They were affirming the man himself. Some in the audience shouted, unable to hold their emotions. "We love you, Elvis," rang out from the left side of the hall, followed by another voice from the back. "Don't change a thing." The cries were unpolished, heartfelt, like the kind of thing shouted in a revival tent rather than a Vegas showroom. Elvis's face softened. He smiled faintly, not the wide grin he used for cameras, but something smaller, almost private. He leaned closer to the microphone and answered in a voice just loud enough to be heard, "I love y'all too." The words were simple, yet they carried more power than any practiced speech. The accent in his reply was unmistakable, and this time Instead of being mocked, it was cherished. The hall shifted again. What had started as an expensive evening of entertainment now felt like a gathering of souls. Men who had walked in stiff with pride found themselves clapping until their hands stung. Women dabbed at their eyes, unashamed of their tears. Even the casino regulars, hardened by endless nights of gambling and neon, stood caught in the spell, unwilling to break it. The atmosphere became almost sacred. The crowd no longer acted like an audience watching a show. They became participants in something unspoken. It was as if every breath synchronized, the room inhaling and exhaling with him, hearts beating to the rhythm of his truth. Elvis sensed it. He had performed in stadiums, in arenas where thousands screamed so loudly he could barely hear himself. He had stood before cameras broadcasting his image to millions around the globe. But rarely had he felt a crowd lean into him like this, not out of frenzy, but out of unity. He rested his hand on the microphone stand, head bowed for a moment, letting the energy wash over him. When he lifted his eyes again, they glistened. "I don't take this for granted," he said softly. "Not 1 minute of it. Y'all have given me a life I never thought I'd have, and if my voice, just the way it is, could bring me here, then maybe it ain't such a bad voice after all." The audience roared, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with a release of tension that felt almost like relief. The sound rolled forward in waves, not neat applause, but something more chaotic, more human, like the breaking of a dam. People shouted, clapped, some even whistled. But it wasn't noise for noise's sake. It was gratitude. And as Elvis stood in that storm, something shifted within him too. For all the years he had carried the sting of being called hillbilly, all the times critics mocked his drawl in print, this was the answer he had never expected. He had turned their insult into belonging, and now the very sound of his voice was what bound him to 20,000 hearts at once. The woman who had mocked him earlier sat silent. Her companions cheered along with the rest, perhaps louder than anyone, desperate to distance themselves from her cruelty. She looked smaller now, no longer a figure of elegance but of isolation, caught in the tidal wave of unity that she herself had broken. Elvis didn't look her way again. He didn't need to. His victory wasn't over her. It was over the doubt planted in him since boyhood. And he had won not by shouting, but by being entirely himself. The hall, once fragmented, some laughing, some indifferent, some adoring, was now one body, one spirit, breathing in unison. The king had reminded them all that greatness doesn't come from polish or perfection, but from the courage to stand unashamed in your own skin. And as the applause swelled once more, Elvis closed his eyes for a second, letting the sound of unity fill him the way hymns once had in the small wooden church in Tupelo. The ovation had risen to a storm and then softened again, like the tide pulling back from the shore. Elvis remained still for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the microphone, as though he, too, needed time to breathe. The audience waited, hushed, sensing instinctively that the evening had turned into something beyond performance. When the first quiet settled, he turned slightly, nodding to the orchestra. They lifted their instruments, expectant. But instead of one of his usual show-stopping rock numbers, he gestured toward something else. The conductor gave a subtle signal, and the opening chords drifted out, gentle, solemn, unmistakably sacred. It was, "You'll Never Walk Alone." The choice hit the room like a revelation. This was not Vegas flash, not a chart-topping hit to send gamblers back to their tables buzzing. It was a hymn, a prayer set to melody, something that reached back to his childhood church pews. Elvis closed his eyes as he began to sing, and the first notes poured out with a tremor that was almost unbearably human. His voice wasn't flawless. It cracked slightly on the opening phrase, strained under the weight of emotion. But instead of diminishing the performance, it deepened it. Every break, every quiver made it real, raw, undeniable. The Southern cadence lingered in every vowel, not as something to hide, but as the very soul of the song. The crowd fell utterly silent. No one moved, no glasses clinked, no whispers broke the air. The melody rose, gathering strength, and suddenly the full orchestra surged behind him. The strings soared, the brass rang out, and Elvis's voice, fragile and powerful at once, filled every inch of the cavernous hall. People began to cry openly. Hardened men in tuxedos dabbed their eyes with folded handkerchiefs. Women clasped their hands at their chests. Even those who had come to scoff found themselves swallowed in the tide of emotion. The sound was too overwhelming, too honest, to resist. Toward the back, the woman who had mocked him earlier sat stiff, her eyes darting nervously while those around her were swept away. Her laughter from earlier seemed impossibly small now, like a forgotten whisper against the roar of truth unfolding before her. She could not escape the fact that she had tried to reduce him, and he had answered not with scorn, but with transcendence. When the final line came, walk on, with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone." He leaned into the words as if they belonged to everyone in the room. His voice cracked again, but the orchestra swelled to hold him, and the audience seemed to rise with him, carried by something larger than music. By the time the last note dissolved into silence, the hall was shaking with the force of people leaping to their feet, clapping, shouting, sobbing. The ovation seemed endless. It wasn't polite applause. It was release, catharsis, gratitude. People weren't simply celebrating a song. They were thanking him for taking them somewhere they hadn't expected to go. Elvis bowed slightly, his expression calm, almost serene. He stepped back from the microphone, acknowledging the orchestra, the band, but the crowd knew the night belonged to him alone. As the cheering finally ebbed, he left the stage, walking into the wings with a dignity that silenced even the most persistent shouts of "Encore!" Backstage, the mood was quieter. A few friends and staff gathered, speaking in low tones. Then, unexpectedly, two well-dressed men approached him, hesitant but determined. They introduced themselves as acquaintances of the woman who had mocked him. Their voices faltered with embarrassment as they explained that they felt ashamed of her behavior and wanted to apologize on her behalf. Elvis listened without anger, without triumph. He gave them the same gentle smile that had disarmed millions. "Don't worry about it," he said softly, adjusting the scarf around his neck. "Everybody's got their own battles." It was not bitterness, not victory, but grace. The kind of grace that comes from someone who has carried hurt for a lifetime and learned to transform it instead of passing it on. Later, as the stagehands dismantled equipment and the last audience members drifted back to the neon glow of the casino floor, the weight of the night remained. The performance had not been just another Vegas show. It had been something unforgettable, something that lifted a ballroom full of strangers into a single moment of truth. For those who were there, the memory endured. They would tell their friends for years how a wealthy woman had tried to laugh at the king of rock and roll, and how, instead of lashing out, he turned the night into something sacred. And though history often remembers Elvis for the glitter, the fame, and the frenzy, those who sat in that hall knew they had seen something deeper. They had seen a man stand unashamed in his roots, carrying with him the voices of his mother, his neighbors, his childhood churches. They had seen him wield humility as strength and transform ridicule into reverence. The narrator's voice seems to whisper across time. On that night in Las Vegas, a woman thought she could diminish his voice. But it was that very voice, the voice of the South, the voice of Elvis, that filled 20,000 people with tears and left them standing in awe. It was not just music. It was the sound of a man's soul.